You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
One evening in February of 1992, a newly married man who lived in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood in Minnesota returned home from work. When he walked inside, he saw his young son was working on some homework at the table, and his 8-month-old baby daughter was crying in her playpen. But the man's wife was nowhere to be found. He asked his son if he had seen his mother, and the boy said no. So the husband began walking around the house, looking for his wife and calling out to her. But he couldn't find her, and she never called back. Eventually, during his search, the man reached the master bedroom. And when he opened the door and saw what was inside, he fell to his knees in horror. Moments later, the police were screaming to his residence, sirens blaring. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remove the rubber lip from the Amazon Music follow button's dustpan so they can never quite get everything up when they're sweeping. Okay, let's get into today's story. 38-year-old Linda Jensen could not believe how lucky she was. As she and her husband Charlie looked down at the beautiful face of their brand new baby daughter, Linda could not stop smiling. And when Charlie leaned down and gave Linda's cheek a gentle kiss and told her how much he loved her, Linda felt like her heart might burst with happiness. For both Linda and Charlie, this moment and this new addition to their family was something neither of them could have imagined when they first met almost 27 years earlier. That's when Linda, age 8, had gone on a summer vacation with her family to Spicer, Minnesota, where they stayed in a lakefront cabin that had been owned by one of Charlie's relatives. Charlie, who had been 12 at the time, had spent most of his time at the lake playing with Linda's 2 brothers. But as summers went by and Linda and Charlie both grew out of their awkward teenage years, the childhood friends had eventually become childhood sweethearts. And after Charlie came back home to Minnesota after serving in the U.S. Army as a combat soldier in Vietnam, everyone in both their families knew that Charlie and Linda would get married. Charlie in his dress military uniform, and Linda looking beautiful and radiant in her white bridal gown. 4 years later, on January 27, 1974, the couple had their first child, a little boy named Andrew. But by the time Andrew was just 4 years old, his parents' marriage had fallen apart. Like a lot of other Vietnam veterans, Charlie had come back from the war with a psychological condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included feelings of irritability and edginess that had been triggered by his combat experience. And over the years, Charlie's drug of choice for treating his PTSD was alcohol. Lots and lots of alcohol. Finally, in 1978, after nearly 7 years of marriage, Linda had filed for divorce. Not because she didn't love Charlie, but because his constant drinking had made their life together impossible. And after that divorce, Linda would spend the next 12 years of her life never quite able to forget Charlie, and also never quite able to find any relationship that didn't end in one kind of a disaster or another. There had been a long-term relationship that had produced another son, a little boy named Joey, but that relationship ended without Linda marrying Joey's father. Not long after that, there had been one more failed marriage, which had taken Linda and Joey first to Colorado and then to California. In both relationships, the breakups had left very bad feelings. Linda's ex-boyfriend and Joey's father had been a partner with anger and substance abuse issues, who refused to pay child support for Joey. Linda's ex-husband, who still lived out in California, had adopted Joey, but he'd never forgiven Linda for not having any children with him. And things had only gotten messier during the divorce proceedings when her ex-husband, John Silliman, was ordered to pay Linda $300 a month in child support for Joey. Finally, with no place left to go, Linda had accepted the offer from her older sister, Sandy, that Linda and Joey should just come back home to Minneapolis and live with Sandy until Linda could pick up the pieces of her broken life. Now, as Linda looked up at Charlie from her bed in the hospital maternity ward, she could not even see the smallest trace of the angry and damaged-seeming young man she had left behind 13 years earlier. Because, for Charlie, the divorce from Linda had been a wake-up call. And once he realized just how much his drinking had cost him in terms of his marriage, family, friendships, money, and work, Charlie had made a promise to himself and to his son, Andrew, that he would get clean and sober. And that's exactly what Charlie did. And by the time Linda had returned to Minnesota, settled herself and her 8-year-old Joey into her sister Sandy's cozy little wood-paneled bungalow and started looking for a job, bumping into Charlie again was like meeting up with the man of her dreams. No longer a drinker, Charlie was now a successful carpenter and contractor who had taught those carpentry skills to their son Andrew. And like Linda, Charlie was unattached, and the same attraction and feeling of friendship that had drawn them together back when they were childhood sweethearts was still very much there. In fact, the hard life experience they both had gained in the years they'd spent apart seemed to make that attraction even stronger and deeper. And before long, Linda was slipping out of the house she shared with her sister a few evenings a week after Joey was in bed, and coming home later in the evening looking like she just won the lottery. Sandy and Linda had always been very close, and Sandy had been the one person Linda had confided in over the course of the last 12 stormy years. And Sandy knew her sister well enough to know that there was only one man who had ever made Linda look that happy, and that man was Charlie Jensen. So it came as no surprise to Sandy when Linda and Charlie had announced that they would be getting married again. And the date they chose for their wedding, April 3rd, 1991, was exactly 20 years to the day that they had gotten married the first time, 20 years earlier. What had been a surprise had been the fact that shortly after moving in with Charlie, Linda had gotten pregnant. And by the time the couple had said "I do" to one another for the second time in their lives, Linda was already 7 months along. And now, 2 months later, on June 12th, 1991, Charlie, who was 42 at the time, and Linda, who was 4 days shy of her 39th birthday, were once again brand new parents. And for Linda, the arrival of baby Lisa marked the beginning of the life she had spent the last 12 years looking for. By late February 1992, when baby Lisa was 8 months old, Linda, Charlie, Joey, and Lisa had all settled into a comfortable routine. The roomy 3-bedroom house that Charlie had just finished building 2 summers ago had a deep wooden porch out front that overlooked the yard and driveway and the trees that shaded the house from the sun. It was one of Linda's favorite places, and it also became a gathering spot for Andrew, who now had a son of his own, and for Linda's sister, Sandy, who visited as much as she could to see Linda and the kids. Linda had taken time off from her job working at a local school with disabled children. Charlie had plenty of construction jobs, but he still managed to spend as much time as he could with Linda and their grandson, as well as with Lisa, Joey, and Andrew. And by late summer, Linda had gotten back to her regular exercise routine. In addition to dropping in at the local health club, Linda had also started running again, and it wasn't long before she was a very familiar sight in the nearby neighborhoods that were part of her daily 5-mile loop. And it wasn't just Linda, Charlie, and baby Lisa who were all thriving. Linda's son, Joey, who had been disabled by a severe stroke when he was just 6 weeks old, had also settled happily into his new life in Minnesota. He enjoyed being part of a close and loving family, and he enjoyed his role as big brother, and now that he was about to turn 10 years old, Joey was also looking forward to joining the local Boy Scout troop. It wasn't until the last weekend in February, on Saturday, February 22nd, that Linda had given her sister, Sandy, the most recent update on the one dark cloud that had drifted into the Jensens' otherwise very sunny life. The sisters were sitting on the sofa in the living room, catching up on family news. Linda had talked to the local Boy Scout troop leader about signing Joey up for Boy Scouts. Charlie was working on a construction site all the way out in Maplewood, 50 miles away, and that after a long Minnesota winter, March and spring were finally not too far away. But when the ring of the telephone interrupted their conversation, Sandy immediately noticed the look of strain that flashed across Linda's face. Sandy knew that sometime within the last 2 weeks, Linda had gotten 2 calls from Joey's biological father, Robert Beard. Despite having given up custody of Joey and not paying child support, Robert was now insisting on having longer and more frequent visitation with his 9-year-old son. Linda had left Robert after he had become physically abusive, so Robert's calls and escalating demands had felt very threatening as well as upsetting. But a moment later, Linda's face had relaxed, and she had insisted to Sandy that she, Linda, and Charlie had the situation under control. and by the time Sandy was ready to go, the conversation had veered into memories of the past, and Linda's announcement that Charlie had always been the only man Linda had ever loved. By the time Sandy was hugging Linda goodbye, Linda was joking that the only real problem in her life now were the painful shin splints she had gotten from all of her recent running. And 2 days later, on the morning of Monday, February 24th, that was absolutely true. When Linda woke up that morning and took her first few steps across the cold bedroom floor, she winced as the sudden pain flared up along her shin bones. But glancing at her watch, Linda actually welcomed how fast the pain had cleared her mind, because once again, she had managed to oversleep. After pulling on her sweatsuit over her t-shirt and underwear and checking that baby Lisa was still asleep, Linda hurried into Joey's room to wake him up. Linda had meant to get out of bed when Charlie had kissed her goodbye and left for work at 6:45 a.m., but the last thing she remembered was hearing Charlie tell her that he'd changed baby Lisa's diaper and that he'd see Linda that evening after he got back from Maplewood. Peeking out the window now, Linda saw that it had snowed the night before, which meant that Andrew's outdoor carpentry job would be canceled and Linda would not be watching her grandson that day. Linda was glad that Charlie's job out in Maplewood was indoors, but she also couldn't help thinking how nice it would have been if today had been a snow day for them too. By 7:45 a.m., baby Lisa was awake and had her morning feeding, and Joey, his breakfast toast still clutched in his hand, was climbing onto the school bus and waving back to Linda and his 8-month-old sister. After watching the bus drive off down County Road 15, Linda turned back to the house and walked on sore legs to the front door. She had told Charlie before he left for work, and before she fell asleep instead of getting up, that her shins hurt too much to go running that day, so her plan for the day was just to hang out with the children and enjoy the view through the sliding glass door that led out onto the front deck. Now standing at baby Lisa's changing table, Linda unwrapped Lisa from her cocoon of blankets, but decided to leave the baby in her pajamas in the playpen while Linda cleaned up the breakfast dishes. But just as Linda was ready to go back out to the living room and get Lisa dressed for the day, Linda was surprised by the sound of a knock on the front door. The Jensen house was set far enough away from the road with a long enough driveway that the family did not get that many unexpected visitors. But this was Big Lake, Minnesota, population just over 3,000 people, and most people here never even bothered to lock their doors, let alone think twice about opening that door to a neighbor who might need help or a favor. So, after leaving baby Lisa right where she was, in the playpen in the living room, Linda dried her hands on a kitchen towel, and with a smile, she walked to the front door. At least she'd have something interesting to talk to Charlie about when he called, as he always did, sometime during the morning from any job site where he was working. It was 9:30 a.m. when Charlie made his first call home to Linda. She usually picked up right away, eager to find out how he was doing and tell him about something wonderful that Lisa had just accomplished. Now, frowning a little, he drummed his fingers on the telephone receiver while he waited for Linda to pick up. Instead, the answering machine came on, and so Charlie left a message for his wife, telling her he'd try again later. But after the third unanswered call of the day, Charlie decided to leave work early. Linda sometimes screened telephone calls by letting them go to the answering machine, but if that was the case today, she would have picked up as soon as she heard his voice leaving a message. As he hopped into his truck and drove northwest from Maplewood towards Big Lake, Charlie told himself not to worry. Maybe Linda had decided to take a nap at the same time she had put Lisa down for a nap. Maybe she'd stepped outside onto the front deck to look at the snowfall. And besides, school had let out, so by now, Joey should be home with his mom and baby sister. By the time Charlie walked into his house, it was 4:05 p.m., and the first thing he noticed was the sound of 8-month-old Lisa crying. Charlie immediately yelled out for Linda, but Linda didn't yell back. Dropping his coat onto the nearest chair, Charlie followed the sound of Lisa's crying through the dining room, where he saw Joey doing his homework at a small table near the wall, and into the living room, where he saw baby Lisa in her playpen, still in her pajamas, her face red and wet with tears. Even as Charlie picked Lisa out of the playpen and stepped over to the foot of the stairs to call his wife's name again, he knew something was wrong. Linda would never have let Lisa stay in last night's pajamas for the entire day. And again, when Charlie did not get a response from Linda, he put Lisa back down inside of the playpen and automatically began a search of the house for his wife. Joey had seemed uncertain when Charlie asked whether Joey had seen his mom, so telling Joey not to worry, Charlie started his search in the laundry room in the basement where Linda would have been out of Joey's sight. But by the time Charlie left the empty basement to check the upstairs bedrooms, he wasn't even trying to act calm. Taking the stairs two at a time, the question went round and round in his mind. What on earth could have happened to his wife? But not even Charlie's worst nightmares could have prepared him for what was inside of the bedroom that he and Linda shared. When he pushed open the bedroom door, the first thing he saw was a bundled up white quilt on the floor at the foot of the bed. Only it wasn't just a quilt. Peeking out from the folds of the material, Charlie could see Linda's shiny dark curls and her long, bare, slender legs. And in the middle of the quilt, at the center of a dark red stain, Charlie saw the wooden handle of one of the kitchen knives he and Linda kept in a butcher's block on their kitchen counter. Falling to his knees on the floor next to Linda's body, Charlie reached out and pushed a fold of the quilt down so he could see Linda's face. And that's when Charlie knew that the woman he had loved ever since they were both children was dead. A few minutes later, and the circular drive in front of the Jensens' two-story house had started filling with emergency medical vehicles and deputies from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department. Charlie's 911 call had summarized everything the newly widowed husband would be able to tell police about his wife's murder. Quote, "My wife is dead. I just got home and my little boy is here, and I checked in the bedroom and she's been stabbed. I've got 2 kids here. My God, what's happened?" As medics entered the house and confirmed that Linda was dead, deputies from the sheriff's department got busy putting yellow crime scene tape up around the perimeter of the Jensens' house. They also began spreading out into the rural neighborhood to see if anyone in the area might have seen or heard anything unusual that day. Knowing they had a homicide on their hands, the Sherburne Sheriff's Department immediately contacted the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, located 47 miles southeast in the city of St. Paul. Soon, along with state investigators, the Sherburne Sheriff's Department would also get help from law enforcement in Benton and Stearns counties, along with help from the nearby cities of St. Cloud and Elk River. But even before those outside agencies had arrived in Big Lake to help conduct interviews and process the crime scene, investigators with the sheriff's department had already come to some of their own conclusions about the murder. After doing an informal interview with Charlie, who had described his entire day and all his interactions with his wife, from the time he woke up and left for work, to the series of unanswered phone calls, right up until the moment he dialed 911, police were working on the assumption that Linda had probably been murdered sometime that morning. That guess would later be confirmed by the autopsy report on Linda's body, which would further narrow the time of the crime to sometime between 8 and 10 a.m. Based on the brutality of the crime and the fact that there was no sign of forced entry and nothing of value appeared to be missing, police also assumed that this crime was personal, not the result of a robbery gone wrong. And finally, given that Linda was naked when she was wrapped into the white quilt and then stabbed, police also believed that what they were looking at was not just a murder, but a violent sexual assault. And this assumption would also be confirmed when the medical examiner found traces of semen on Linda's ankle and inside of her body, along with defensive wounds that suggested that she had struggled with all her might against her attacker. The medical examiner would also discover that the actual cause of Linda's death was strangulation, and that she had likely been dead even before the killer had plunged the 10-inch long blade of the butcher's knife so deeply into her chest that the fabric of the quilt had become embedded in the wound. According to one investigator, it looked to the police like someone had actually tried to carve Linda's heart out of her chest. And Linda's sister, Sandy, would later remember the medical examiner telling her that along with the surface bruises, scratches, and deeper bruising to her sister's body, there was a single dried tear on Linda's cheek. But unfortunately for investigators, even though they had lots of details about how Linda had died, they did not have many clues about who might have committed the crime. It would also turn out that aside from the semen samples that the medical examiner would find in and on Linda's body, there just wasn't much physical and forensic evidence that crime scene techs were able to recover from inside of the Jensen house. Whoever had raped and killed Linda had stripped the sheets, which may have contained hair, blood, and skin tissues, and taken them away with them. According to Charlie, the only other items that appeared to be missing might also have contained DNA evidence: the t-shirt and underwear that Linda had been wearing that morning and that she was probably still wearing when she was attacked. The first obvious suspect in Linda's murder was her husband, Charlie Jensen. It hadn't taken police long to learn that the couple had been married back in 1971, but had divorced because of Charlie's post-traumatic stress disorder, which made him prone to anger and irritability, coupled with his alcohol abuse. But over the next 72 hours, the police would confirm Charlie's work alibi. Charlie would also pass a lie detector test and volunteer a DNA sample that would eventually rule him out as Linda's killer. But even as Charlie was being cleared from the suspect list, police were already following what they believed was a very promising lead provided by the mail carrier who delivered mail along the rural route where Charlie and Linda lived. According to the mail carrier, when she had arrived at the Jensen house at 11:30 a.m. on Monday, February 24th, the day of the murder, she saw a white male in a copper-colored pickup truck pulling out of the Jensen's driveway. The mail carrier's description was detailed enough that police artists were able to put together a sketch that showed a man in his 30s or maybe 40s with scraggly brown hair and a gray flecked beard who had what looked, to the mail carrier, like red scratches on his hands. Less than an hour after the sketch was released to the media and featured in print and TV news, the tips from the public started to pour in. And soon police were interviewing anyone in Big Lake Township who had reported seeing the copper-colored 1970s Ford pickup truck or its alleged driver. On March 2nd, 6 days after Linda's murder and 2 days after her funeral service, a heartbroken Charlie Jensen packed up the home he had built for himself and Linda and moved his little family into an apartment building. As Charlie would tell his adult son Andrew and Linda's sister Sandy, it was just too hard for Charlie to walk into that bedroom where Linda had been killed. 11 days later, and 17 days after Linda's death, police saw their only solid lead in the Linda Jensen homicide go up in smoke. The mail carrier, who had helped police draw a sketch of a possible suspect she saw driving away from the Jensen's property on the morning of the murder, began to change her story. She now thought that instead of being copper-colored, the truck she saw might have been light green with white panels and snowplow brackets on the front. And instead of having a scraggly beard, the driver may have been wearing a coat with a fur-lined collar. Meanwhile, police investigating other men in Linda's life were also running into dead ends. After learning that Joey's biological father, Robert Beard, had been arguing with Linda in the 2 weeks before her death about visitation with Joey, they didn't waste any time bringing Robert in for questioning. Police also knew from conversations with Linda's family that Linda had said that Robert had been physically abusive and had a bad temper as well as substance abuse issues. And at first, Robert Beard looked like he could become the new #1 murder suspect. In conversations with police, he was angry and defensive. He lied to investigators, denying that he had recently spoken with Linda on the phone. His alibi, that he was home alone at the time of the murder, was weak. But Robert also pointed out that since he did not have a car or driver's license, there was no way he could have gotten undetected to Linda's house and killed her. Once Robert lawyered up and refused to give police a DNA sample, the only thing police could do was keep him on the suspect list and move on to the next man in Linda's life, her ex-husband, John Silliman, who lived in California. Although John's alibi, that he was working at a local elementary school on the day of Linda's murder, turned out to be airtight, there was something about John that just made police suspicious. He'd clearly had a volatile relationship with Linda, and he told police that Linda had pressured him into adopting Joey instead of having children of their own. It wasn't until police went through John's financial records with a fine-tooth comb to rule out any murder-for-hire scheme that police crossed John off their list of suspects. By the end of May 1992, 9 weeks after Linda had been found brutally raped and murdered in her own bedroom, the investigation into her death had ground to a halt. Police from 3 different jurisdictions had followed up on more than 1,000 tips. They had interviewed hundreds of friends, coworkers, family members, neighbors, and possible suspects. They had searched but failed to find any trace of the sheets and clothing that had been taken from the Jensen house on the morning of Monday, February 24th. They had also collected and stored more than 80 DNA samples from men who had any connection to Linda, from a trainer at her gym who had once given her a bouquet of flowers to her ex-lover and husbands. None of them would match the semen sample collected from Linda's body. But while investigators may have quietly and reluctantly shelved the murder book on Linda Jensen, there were 3 people in Linda's life who absolutely refused to let the case go completely cold. At least twice a week for the next 7 years, Linda's older sister, Sandy, called the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department asking if there had been any developments in the case. Charlie also remained in touch with police, and he and Sandy made an appearance together on a popular TV show that featured true crime, hoping that the publicity might result in someone coming forward with new evidence. The third person who would not let the case go was one of its lead investigators. Bruce Anderson had made a promise to the Jensen family that he would not retire from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department until law enforcement had found the person who had killed Linda Jensen. Like Sandy, Deputy Anderson was convinced that someone out in Big Lake Township held the key to solving this homicide, that someone had information that they might be holding back or that they didn't realize was important. Even after all the leads seemed to dry up, Sandy, Charlie, and Deputy Anderson had one strategy left. They all urged law enforcement and the media to ask again if anyone could remember anything that might turn out to be related to the murder. But it wasn't until the early summer of 2000, more than 8 years after Linda Jensen's murder, that police finally got the tip they needed to break Linda's unsolved homicide case wide open. By then, Bruce Anderson had been elected sheriff of the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department, a position that gave him the authority to call for the creation of a special cold case task force of state and local law enforcement whose job would be to reopen the investigation into Linda's murder. The new round of publicity, along with a $20,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Linda's killer, was enough to get people, once again, talking and thinking about the unsolved homicide that had terrified the residents of Big Lake back in 1992. And on a mild day in June of 2000, the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department got a visit from a woman named Angela Hennon. The renewed interest in Linda Jensen's murder and Sandy's pleas through the newspapers for everyone to search their memory for anything that might shed light on her sister's murder had finally struck a chord. And after 8 years, Angela was finally ready to give police the man that she had long suspected of hiding a very dark secret. What police found out when they followed up on Angela's tip would send shockwaves throughout the state of Minnesota. And based on that information, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe really happened to Linda Jensen on the morning of Monday, February 24th, 1992. The knock on the front door of Charlie and Linda's house was so not expected that Linda almost dropped the plate she was holding into the open dishwasher. But even though she was surprised to have a visitor this early in the morning, it never occurred to Linda not to answer the door, especially since another loud knock might wake up 8-month-old baby Lisa, who had fallen asleep in the playpen in the living room. So, after wiping her hands dry on a kitchen towel and zipping the top of her tracksuit all the way up to her chin, Linda pushed her hair back from her face and walked out to see who was coming to call. Even as she started to peer out one of the front windows, Linda recognized the voice calling to her from outside. A moment later, and Linda's visitor was stamping the snow off his boots before stepping through the open door. But even as Linda closed the door behind her visitor and apologized for how untidy her house was, Linda's killer was hardly listening. Instead, he was drinking in every detail of Linda's appearance. He had been watching Linda for such a long time, but until now, he had never really been alone with her. never really had a chance to let her know how he felt about her. He wanted to ask her if she was planning to go for a run that day, and he wanted to tell her how much he always looked forward to seeing her jog past the house where he lived with his wife and 4 kids. But before he could even find a way to put his proposal to Linda, he could see that she had stopped smiling and had even taken a few steps backward. And now she was asking him what he was doing there, because now really wasn't a great time after all for her to have any company. And if this was about Joey, she'd rather talk some other time when Charlie was there too. But before Linda could get any further away from him, the killer reached out his hand and grabbed her arm. And as soon as he did that, he knew it didn't matter how Linda felt about him or what Linda wanted. What mattered was what he wanted. And after a short but violent struggle, the killer had Linda right where he wanted her. Upstairs in the master bedroom, all her clothes stripped off, her dark curly hair spread out on the bed under him, looking just as she looked in all of his fantasies, right down to having his hands wrapped around her slender throat, squeezing as hard as he could until finally she stopped struggling and lay still. Once Linda's killer was finished, he bundled her body inside of a clean white quilt and pushed her down onto the floor at the foot of the bed. Still breathing heavily, the killer straightened his own clothing, then left the bedroom and went down to the kitchen. On the counter, next to a jar of red and white candy canes, he saw the butcher's block with its collection of kitchen knives. Grabbing the wooden handle of the largest knife, Linda's killer hurried back upstairs to the bedroom. Looking down at Linda, lying on her back with the quilt wrapped around her, all he could see of her body was the top of her head, and her slim legs from the knees down, her heels resting lightly on the floorboards. Straddling Linda's midsection, the killer raised the knife and began stabbing at Linda's heart, over and over again, until finally plunging the knife through the center of her ribcage with so much force that it pinned the quilt into Linda's chest. After hauling himself back up onto his feet, the killer turned to the bed and stripped off the sheets and gathered up Linda's torn t-shirt and underwear. Rolling everything into a ball, the killer took one last look around and then left the bedroom, hurried down the steps, picked up his coat from where he had dropped it near the door, and just a few minutes later, Charlie and Linda's neighbor and the leader of the local Boy Scout troop, 28-year-old Kent Jones, was already halfway back to his own house less than half a mile away. In the weeks after Linda's murder, local police would interview Kent Jones after hearing a report that he had seen the copper-colored truck police were looking for driving around Big Lake Township. But during that routine interview, not only did Kent deny knowing Linda Jensen, Kent's wife gave her husband an alibi for the day of Linda's murder. It wasn't until 8 years later that Angela Hennon, who had had an affair with Kent sometime after Linda's death, would tell police that whenever she had brought up the subject of Linda's death, a crime that everyone at the time was talking about, Kent reacted violently. When Angela had asked if Kent had ever met Linda, at first he insisted really aggressively that he had not. But later, Kent brought up the subject himself and told Angela that in fact, he had known Linda. Kent's violent reaction and the way he talked about Linda Jensen had always made Angela wonder, in the very back of her mind, if Kent might have somehow been involved in Linda's death. It would turn out that Angela's suspicions were 100% correct. Not only did Kent Jones know Linda from her inquiries to him about getting Joey signed up for Boy Scouts, he had become obsessed with the beautiful dark-haired woman he'd seen out running several times a week. And he had begun to watch her closely and learn her routines and fantasize about her constantly. When police re-interviewed Kent in June of 2000, Kent's wife contradicted Kent's claim that he had never met Linda. In front of investigators, Deborah Jones reminded Kent that Linda had actually come by their house to pick up a Boy Scout application for her 9-year-old son. Police also discovered that Kent had a criminal record. He had been convicted of insurance fraud, and in 1995, 3 years after Linda's murder, Kent had been convicted of domestic violence. That charge stemmed from an incident in which Kent's wife was hospitalized for 4 days after suffering a stab wound to her stomach and 2 puncture wounds on her forearm. Deborah would later tell police that the stab wound was the result of an accident, that she had slipped and fallen onto the knife, which was resting blade up in the family's open dishwasher. Although Kent refused to voluntarily give up a sample of his DNA, investigators quickly came back with a search warrant that forced him to provide a DNA sample. Less than 1 month later, the DNA analysis came back with a match. Kent Jones's DNA matched the DNA found in the semen that the medical examiner had collected from Linda's body. On July 25, 2000, 8 years and 5 months after Linda Jensen's brutal murder, police arrested Kent Jones for first-degree murder and sexual assault. 17 months after his arrest, on December 8, 2001, and then again at a new trial 5 years later, Kent Jones was found guilty of those charges and sentenced to life in prison. In 2009, 17 years after Linda's murder, Angela Hennon would collect $18,000 in reward money for giving police the tip that led to the arrest and conviction of Kent Jones. For Charlie Jensen, Linda's death at the hands of Kent Jones has left some scars that will just never go away. Quote, "He took a mother away from her children, a wife from her husband, and a beautiful person away from the world." End quote.
You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
In the fall of 1995, firefighters in Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, responded to a call about a fire in a suburban neighborhood. When they got there, they managed to mostly put out the intense flames inside the building, at which point they formed a line and began moving down the first-floor hallway, systematically checking the rooms to see if anyone had been left inside. But before the firefighters reached the end of the hallway, the floor suddenly gave out from underneath them, sending the lead firefighter down into a hidden crawl space 4 feet below. The man was unhurt from the fall, but when he tried to stand up to climb back out again, he noticed that there was something horrifying in that crawl space with him. This discovery would send shockwaves through a town that until that moment had been best known for its churches and championship Little League baseball teams. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to edit the Amazon Music follow buttons video, but do it so that the audio and visual are slightly out of sync. Okay, let's get into today's story. 28-year-old Patricia Kimball had to force herself to smile as she looked out at the laughing group of friends who filled her backyard. There was no question that the Saturday evening barbecue for her fellow Sunday school teachers and other members of the Elm Street Baptist Church had been a very big success. It was September 9th, 1995, and the early fall air had been warm without being hot, and the clouds passing now and then over the sun, along with the leafy trees that stood around the Kimball single-story greenhouse, offered just the right amount of evening shade. And not that long ago, this happy gathering would have represented everything that Patricia had ever wanted in life, and everything she had always loved about her small hometown of Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. There was her 26-year-old husband with his toothy smile, green eyes, and strong, sturdy build, and right next to him was Patricia's brother, Reuben, and his wife, Christy, and just off to Patricia's right, she could see her closest friends laughing and chatting as they began to gather up empty plates and leftovers and take them into the kitchen. And out of sight, but still within 30 miles of where Patricia was standing, there was the apartment complex where she worked as a manager, there was the building supply store that her husband owned, and there were the homes of her parents, her in-laws, and her cousins. But ever since Patricia's marriage 17 months earlier, the happiness that Patricia had expected to feel as she assembled these building blocks of a good life, husband, family, church, friends, and work, had slowly faded. And in its place was Patricia's growing sense that the future she had imagined when she walked down the aisle to exchange rings with the man she had loved ever since she first laid eyes on him might never materialize. Yes, she and Ted had their cozy 3-bedroom house on Brandon Station Court, and yes, they were both devout Christians who were active in their church, and yes, Patricia still hoped that she and Ted would start a family together. And yes, some of her anxieties, like the fact that the house she lived in had been robbed twice, had nothing to do with being married. Still, the break-ins had shattered the sense of security Patricia felt as she started her new life with Ted. Even though no one had been hurt, and the burglar who robbed them the second time had eventually been caught by police, Now, no matter how hard Patricia tried to control her fear, she still felt her chest tighten every time she approached the house and saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway or parked out on the road. And maybe it was that feeling of always looking over her shoulder that had made every other event that had nibbled away at Patricia's dream of a safe and happy married life seem worse than it really was. But overall, it just felt to Patricia that the love and romance that brought her and Ted together 3 years ago had been totally replaced by practical daily routines. Instead of spending the weekend together camping in the mountains, she and Ted sat at the kitchen table and paid the bills, or cleaned the house, or mowed the lawn. And Patricia wouldn't have minded the feeling of settling into that kind of routine if she felt like she and Ted were still enjoying their time together. But lately, Patricia had begun to worry that after less than 2 years of marriage, she and Ted were already starting to grow apart. Maybe Ted was even having second thoughts about having married her. After all, Patricia knew that when she had first met Ted almost 5 years ago, back in 1990 at the church youth group, they had been just friends and definitely nothing more. And Patricia also knew that between 1991 and 1992, Ted had had a serious crush on Patricia's second cousin, the beautiful Janet Blakely. But by 1992, when Janet was getting ready to go off to college, Ted had suddenly seemed to notice Patricia in a different way. And it wasn't long before the slim, smart, dark-eyed woman with the knockout smile went from friend to sweetheart and then to wife, leaving Janet Blakely crying in the back of the church when the pastor had announced to the congregation that Ted and Patricia were engaged. At first, when Patricia tried to talk to Ted about their marriage, he had looked at her in surprise, then pulled her close and told her everything was good and she should stop worrying. But when Patricia brought the subject up again, Ted seemed irritated and impatient. And then, just 1 week before today's barbecue, Ted had told Patricia that he had just applied to work a 3 to 11 p.m. shift at a local textile company that manufactured all different kinds of fiber-based materials. Ted's announcement had taken Patricia completely by surprise. There was no question that the two of them had very different attitudes toward money. Patricia had always been a saver, while Ted was more of a spender. In fact, by the time Patricia was 16, she'd set enough money aside to buy her first car, used, and by the time she was 23, she had enough in the bank for a down payment on a house. Ted, on the other hand, loved all the extras that money could buy, outfitting his late-model Jeep Cherokee with all the options, and now he had his eye on a new motorcycle. For Ted, money and social status were very important. He and his younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had spent the early years of their childhood living in a small mobile home in a trailer park on the edge of Pleasant Garden. And Ted's father, an alcoholic, barely made enough money to keep the family afloat. All that had changed when Ron Sr. had given up drinking and taken his wife and 2 sons off to Liberty University in Virginia. After getting his degree in pastoral leadership, Ron Sr. had returned to North Carolina and settled his family in Julian, a few miles south of Pleasant Garden, where he was hired as the pastor of the Monnet Road Baptist Church. But even though the family's financial and social status had improved after Ted's father, Ron Sr., became a pastor, Ted still always was given a lot of responsibility. That included watching out for his younger brother, Ronnie Jr. He was very socially awkward and held back in school by a learning disability. Ronnie Jr. was just not nearly as quick and confident as his older brother was. Still, both boys had always worked hard. Ronnie mostly did odd jobs around the neighborhood until he joined the military and enlisted in the Marine Corps. Ted became such a good employee at the local home building store that when the business owner, Gary Lyle, retired, he sold Lyle's building supply at a very good price to Ted. But even though Patricia understood the reasons why her husband was ambitious and why he enjoyed owning luxuries his family had never been able to afford when he was young, there was just no way that Ted needed to get a second job, especially one that would leave Patricia, who was already spooked by the break-ins, alone at the house that late into the evening. As Patricia turned away from the backyard and stepped into the kitchen to help put away the leftover food, she tried not to think about another possible reason why her husband, the owner of his own successful business, might be looking for additional part-time production line work that paid under $6.50 an hour, so much less than he made at Lyle's Supply. The sound of clattering dishes suddenly brought Patricia's attention back to the present. and pulling on her apron, she gave herself a mental shake. What she really needed to do was stop all this worrying and trust in God's plan for her life. Besides, in another few weeks, she and Ted would be going on a marriage enrichment retreat, and Patricia was sure that once they had a chance to sit down and really talk to each other, they would both find new ways to connect with one another. And she could put all of her jitters and suspicions to rest. Still, Patricia felt a jolt when she finally heard the question that one of the women in the kitchen was repeating for the second time. It was one of Patricia's fellow Sunday school teachers, and she was asking Patricia if it was true that Ted was working at Precision Fabrics out in neighboring Greensboro. Summoning up one more smile, Patricia told her friend that yes, Ted would be starting there in 9 days, on Monday, September 18th. And then, bending over the dishwasher to hide her face, Patricia did her best to sound happy when she added, "And yeah, I think he's really looking forward to it." 1 month after the barbecue for members of the Elm Street Baptist Church, on Monday, October 9th, 1995, Patricia pulled into the parking lot at Cinnamon Ridge Apartments a few minutes before 8 a.m. Before heading into the office where she worked as the property manager, Patricia thought about the telephone call she had made 3 days earlier on Friday night. Patricia and Ted were both very close to Ted's former boss, Gary Lyle, who had basically passed Lyle's supply store on to Ted right after Ted and Patricia got married. But when Gary wasn't there, it was Gary's wife, Rose, that Patricia had talked to on the phone. Patricia had thought for a long time before making that phone call, but considering all that had happened in the last several weeks, Patricia had known that she had to confide in someone, even if what Patricia had to say sounded completely unbelievable. Now, sitting in her car and looking out at the clear sky of what was sure to be a beautiful fall day in North Carolina, Patricia put her hands together at her chest, lowered her head, and said a short prayer, hoping that the prediction she had made to Rose 3 days earlier would never come true. By 3:30 p.m., Patricia was ready to leave the office for the day and head home to 2401 Brandon Station Court and cut the grass. Patricia was glad that the day had been quiet and trouble-free at Cinnamon Ridge. 3 months earlier, in July, Patricia had had to evict one of the tenants at the apartment complex. The confrontation had been ugly, and the tenant had made threats against Patricia's life. As Patricia stood up at her desk and pulled on her light jacket, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and a few minutes later she'd hopped into her car and was making the 13-mile drive south to Pleasant Garden. All in all, it had been a good day. Patricia had used her lunch break to run an errand in Greensboro and to make a surprise stop at Lyle's Supply with a bag of hamburgers and french fries that she'd picked up at a local fast food restaurant for Ted's lunch. The two of them had avoided talking about money, or about the fact that Ted wouldn't be home that evening until after his shift at Precision Fabrics, which ended at 11 p.m. Instead, they talked about what Ted's younger brother, Ronnie Jr., had planned for his short leave home from the Marine base where he was stationed at Camp Lejeune, 3 hours to the southeast in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Like most people who knew the Kimball brothers, Patricia had always been struck by the obvious favoritism that their parents had always shown for Ted. That had always made her feel a little protective of her awkward but straight-arrow brother-in-law, and glad he had met and married his fresh-faced and cheerful wife, Kimberly. Patricia had also reminded Ted that after she mowed the grass that afternoon, she'd be going to a Bible study group that was meeting at 7 p.m. at the church. But at about 4 o'clock, as soon as Patricia caught sight of her house on Brandon Station Court, she knew right away that she'd be changing her afternoon plans. And when she pulled into the driveway of the one-story green home with the American flag next to the door, she smiled, pulling her car over to the far left so she could squeeze in next to the vehicle already parked in her driveway. It didn't matter that Patricia was now parked halfway on top of the grass she intended to cut, because as she turned off the engine and hopped out of the car and headed to the front door, she knew she was not going to be mowing the lawn, at least not yet, because Patricia Kimball had company. A little over 4.5 hours later, the first Pleasant Garden fire engine, lights flashing and volunteer firefighters in full protective gear clinging to the outside grips, came screeching around the bend of Brandon Station Court. All eyes were already on number 2401, the one-story green house that now had waves of thick, muddy-looking smoke pouring out from under the front door and the openings in the chimneys, windows, and vents. And none of these first responders needed to be told that this house belonged to Patricia and Ted Kimball. Because the dispatcher at the fire department, who had taken the 911 call at 8:46 p.m. that evening reporting a house fire at 2401, had been Patricia's godfather. The emergency call was also personal for the lead firefighter, who had hopped down from the jump seat on the fire engine even before the truck had come to a full stop. 24-year-old Alan Fields had gone to high school with Ted Kimball, and he knew Patricia's family, the Blakeleys, even better. According to dispatch, Patricia's brother, Reuben, had gotten a call at about 8 p.m. from Ted at Precision Fabrics, asking Reuben to go check on Patricia, who had not been answering Ted's telephone calls. Now, even before his crew had connected the hose to the nearest fire hydrant, Alan could feel the intense heat coming off the house in waves as he and his fellow firefighters rushed through the carport to the side door of the house that led into the kitchen. But nothing in Alan's 6 years with the fire department had prepared him for the blast of superheated air and smoke that smothered him and his crew as soon as they had pushed through that door. And less than a minute later, unable to see and unable to breathe, Alan frantically motioned his crew backward. As they stumbled back out of the house and pulled off their masks to drink in huge gulps of fresh air, somewhere above and around them, the firefighters could hear the crackle and snap of nearby leaves and tree branches sucking in the heat from the house below. And out in the street, under the flashing lights of the fire engines and the sheriff department cars, firefighters could make out the growing crowd of neighbors and family and friends of the Kimballs and the Blakeleys. Even as Alan called for high-powered fans to clear the smoke from the interior of the house, every firefighter there was already thinking about the sight of Patricia Kimball's car parked over the edge of the driveway, wondering if she was inside, still alive, waiting for them. Just then, Alan heard a shout from the front corner of the house. Using a long metal rod, one of the firefighters had smashed through one of the bedroom windows, hoping they might be able to pull out Patricia or anyone else in the house who might be crouching just on the other side of the wall. But even as the firefighter reached his arm through the window, there was a sudden burst of flames as the oxygen pouring in from outside reignited the hot embers inside. As another team passed a hose through the broken window to douse the fire that had just erupted, Alan and his crew pushed back into the kitchen, following the stream of air from the fans that was slowly knocking aside the walls of smoke. As the pressurized stream from the hose began hitting the walls and floor and ceiling, the air in the kitchen, then the living room, and then the hallway was filled with the sound of sizzling water. Working in the lead, Alan could just barely make out in the darkness the long strips of paint that had blistered and peeled off the walls, and the burned and smoking insulation and crumbling sheetrock scattered around their heavy boots, when suddenly, the floor just seemed to disappear right from under Alan's feet. 1 second he was standing, and the next, he felt himself falling and rolling into a small space under the hallway, a 4-foot deep hole that had burned through the floorboards. But before Alan could even process what had just happened, he was suddenly aware of something firm but yielding underneath him. As Alan put out one gloved hand to steady himself, he suddenly knew with terrible certainty that they had just found 28-year-old Patricia Kimball. By the time Detective Jim Church from the Guilford County Sheriff's Department met up with his supervisor at 2401 Brandon Station Court that night, sheriff deputies had already strung yellow tape around the Kimball's property to hold back the crowd of spectators, and crime lab technicians and Guilford County fire inspectors were already combing through the smoking rubble inside the house. But within minutes, a simple walkthrough of the damaged building, lit by portable floodlights, told Detective Church and Sergeant Detective David DeBerry a lot of what those techs and inspectors would later confirm. The most important and obvious piece of that information was that the fire that had killed Patricia Kimball had not been an accident. Sitting right in the middle of the kitchen was an empty gasoline can, and Detective Church, who was also a volunteer firefighter, pointed out the obvious burn pattern caused by an accelerant like gasoline that led from the kitchen over the back of a couch in the living room and then down the hallway to where Patricia's body had been discovered. The detectives and fire inspector would also agree that whoever had set the fire had probably hoped it would burn long and hot enough to destroy the entire house. Instead, the fire had probably only burned intensely for maybe a few minutes, not hours, leaving the bedrooms in the house practically untouched by actual flames. And those bedrooms, especially the Kimball's master bedroom, told their own part of the story. As investigators stood in the doorway and took in the sight of the emptied-out dresser drawers, overturned nightstand, and the mattress pulled off the bed, they both came to the same conclusion. Before setting the fire, the arsonist had tried to make it look like the house had been robbed. Except the arsonist had not done a very convincing job, leaving behind items like an expensive camera that were of obvious value. There had also been no sign of forced entry into the house. The pry marks that deputies had discovered on the side door into the house were marks that had been left from the robbery that had taken place earlier in that same year. While investigators would go on to spend hours tracking down the robbery gone wrong angle, their initial take on this crime was that the robbery had been staged to cover up the death of Patricia Kimball, and not that Patricia had been killed when she walked into her house and surprised a burglar. There was also the fact that Patricia's car was parked half on the driveway and half on the grass that suggested to detectives that when Patricia had arrived home, there had to have been another vehicle already parked in the driveway. Otherwise, Patricia, who intended to cut the grass, would not have parked on top of the grass. And whoever had been driving that vehicle had to have been someone Patricia knew or recognized. After experiencing 2 traumatic break-ins, police believed there was just no way that Patricia would ever have unlocked her door and entered the house with someone she didn't know. But even before detectives stepped into the room inside of Patricia's house, where her body was now laying on a white sheet, detectives knew that they were not going to have much in the way of physical and forensic evidence to help them in this investigation. Between the fire, smoke damage, and the water from the fire hoses that now sloshed around their feet, they knew that the crime scene techs were just not going to find anything in the way of fingerprints or DNA. Still, the first horrible sight of Patricia's body was enough to make every law enforcement officer in that house 100% committed to finding whoever had set this fire. Surrounded by the ruins of her own wedding pictures and cross-stitched framed Bible verses, nothing recognizable remained of the beautiful, vibrant young woman with the chocolate brown eyes and infectious smile. Patricia lay face down with her arms, bent at the elbow, raised above her head. All but one tuft of clothing had been burned from her body, and only charred stumps remained where her left foot and entire right leg should have been. Around her, patches and smears of bright red blood were the only signs that this had once been a living, breathing human being. And then, scanning the length of the ravaged body, both detectives saw it at the same time. Directly behind Patricia's left ear, there was a small, dark bullet hole. And suddenly, everything about this case changed. Patricia had to have been shot from behind in the head, and by the time the arsonist had staged the robbery and then set the fire, Patricia was already dead. Within 4 days of Patricia's murder, police had already ruled out the most obvious suspects. At the top of that list was Patricia's husband, Ted, not because of any obvious evidence, but because most violent homicides are committed by people close to the victim. But not only was Ted in a state of shock that there was anyone in Pleasant Garden who would want to hurt Patricia, he also had a cast iron alibi for the time of the murder, which the medical examiner had determined must have occurred just after 4 p.m. on the afternoon of October 9th, not long after Patricia had arrived home from work, intending to mow the grass. Answering every question put to him by police, Ted explained that from the time he left his house on that Monday morning at 7:45 a.m. until the time he called Patricia's brother, Ruben, at 8 p.m. to ask Ruben to go check on Patricia, Ted was either at work at Lyle's Supply or at Precision Fabrics. And in between those 2 jobs, he had met up with his mother, Edna Kimball, for dinner at Mrs. Winner's Chicken and Biscuits, a local restaurant not far from Precision Fabrics. Ted's account of Patricia stopping by in the afternoon to meet him for lunch, along with a call he made to her office at Cinnamon Ridge later in the afternoon, just before she left work, also lined up with what police had learned about Patricia's last day from her coworkers. Police also quickly ruled out two other suspects. The man who had broken into the Kimball house early in 1995 could not have murdered Patricia because he was still in jail at the time. Still, Detective Church conducted an interview with the suspect and went over the facts of the earlier break-in. Investigators also tracked down the tenant that Patricia had recently evicted from Cinnamon Ridge Apartments, but she too had an alibi for the time of the murder. But even as detectives seemed to be hitting one dead end after another, they were also turning up more and more information about growing strains between Patricia and Ted in the weeks leading up to Patricia's murder. Patricia had confided to friends that she and Ted argued about Ted spending too much money. Ted had also tried to take out $100,000 of life insurance on his wife, and Patricia had absolutely refused to sign off on the policy. Those same friends also told police that when Ted started working his part-time job at Precision Fabrics about 1 month before Patricia's death, Patricia had worried that he hadn't taken the job because he wanted more money. Instead, he had taken the job because he wanted to spend less time with Patricia. And despite the fact that Ted had an alibi and that he never collected on that life insurance policy, police continued to treat Ted as a suspect, circling back again and again to ask him more questions about his relationship with his wife and looking for inconsistencies in the story Ted had told police about his activities on the day of Patricia's murder. It wasn't until Ted hired a lawyer and later posted a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Patricia's murderer that investigators were forced to leave Ted Kimball alone and admit that the homicide investigation into Patricia's death had started going cold. But for Detective Jim Church, this was a case he just could not let go of. And over the next 14 months, the 49-year-old investigator kept track of any new developments in the lives of Patricia Kimball's family and friends. He also reached out beyond Patricia's immediate circle to interview Ted's brother Ronnie out at Camp Lejeune and any of the women that Ted had dated before he married Patricia, including Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely. But it wouldn't be until late January 1997, more than 1 year after Patricia Kimball's murder, that Detective Church finally got the tip that would break his first homicide investigation wide open. And when that tip came in, Detective Church literally could not believe the identity of the caller, the tipster, at the other end of the telephone line. It was the son of Reverend Jerry Falwell, the founder of Liberty University in Virginia and one of America's best-known Baptist pastors, televangelists, and conservative activists. And according to Jerry Falwell's son and attorney, one of the students enrolled at Liberty University's training program for pastors had just given the Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. the name of someone who might be involved in the death of Patricia Kimball. And a little over 2 months later, Detective Church and Detective DeBerry, along with investigators from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation, were ready to make their first arrests on charges of first-degree murder. Based on the investigation into the tip from Reverend Falwell, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to Patricia Kimball 16 months earlier, on the afternoon of October 9th, 1995. Patricia's killer was patient. Waiting at the Kimball's house, the killer was grateful that 2401 was the only house that had been built yet on Brandon Station Court. It was still possible, but really not very likely, that a neighbor might notice the vehicle in the driveway. Besides, it was not really in the killer's nature to worry about those types of details. Instead, the killer had let themselves inside the house and prepared for the moment when Patricia came home. The killer was methodical. Once they had taken up their position inside the bathroom, just off the hallway that led from the living room down to the 3 bedrooms, the killer racked the slide of the Glock 45 pistol one more time, checked that the bathroom door was not closed all the way, then carefully made another mental review of the plan. It wasn't that the killer disliked Patricia. It wasn't even that the killer stood to benefit from Patricia's death. There were just some responsibilities in life that could not be argued or bargained away, and killing Patricia was one of those obligations. And this would be a fast and merciful death. The killer thought about that and decided that Patricia probably would not even feel any pain, just surprise. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Patricia had stopped her car at an intersection and waved a quick hello to another driver. As Patricia let up on the brake and moved forward again, she thought how completely ordinary her life must seem from the outside. And after spending her lunch with Ted at Lyle's Supply earlier that day, and picking up the phone this afternoon and hearing his familiar voice, Patricia wondered if maybe there was hope for their marriage after all. She had seen how bitter and destructive divorce had been for her own parents, and if she could avoid going down that road herself, she would. And with that thought in mind, Patricia took a deep breath and forced herself to concentrate on the here and now. It was a beautiful, warm afternoon, and it would feel good to get outside and cut the grass, and maybe do some other yard work before getting changed and cleaned up for her evening Bible study group. But when Patricia rounded the curve of Brandon Station Court and saw the vehicle that was sitting in her driveway, her spirits suddenly lifted. This was unexpected, but unlike a lot of the things that had been happening lately in Patricia's life, a visit with this person was unexpected in a good way. Smiling, Patricia pulled her car into the driveway and parked half on the asphalt and half on the grass. A moment later, and Patricia was walking through the open doors of the two-car garage. Calling out a cheerful hello, she reached the side entrance into the kitchen, pushed it open, and stepped inside. Patricia was a little surprised when she heard a slightly muffled answer coming from deeper inside the house, but she didn't hesitate before following the voice down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. And this was exactly the moment the killer had been waiting for. As soon as Patricia passed the closed bathroom on her left, she never even noticed when the door opened behind her. Silent as a ghost, the killer stepped forward, pressed the barrel of the gun against the back of Patricia's skull just behind her left ear, and pulled the trigger. Inside the small house, the blast from the gun was deafening. But even as Patricia's body fell forward onto the hallway floor, arms raised over her head, the killer was already on the move. Picking up the can of gas they had hidden in the bathroom, the killer started in the kitchen and poured a stream of gasoline that led through the living room, over the living room sofa, and down the hallway to Patricia's dead body. Standing over Patricia, the killer poured until Patricia's body was soaked and dripping. Satisfied, the killer headed for the master bedroom. Once there, the killer pulled out the dresser drawers, tossed out the clothes, knocked over the nightstand, and pulled the mattress off the bed. Pausing long enough to catch their breath, the killer went back down the hallway, picked up the empty can of gasoline, and then walked quickly into the kitchen, putting the can down on the floor where police would find it almost 5 hours later. Taking a few steps backward, the killer took the packet of matches out of their pocket. There was a scraping sound as the head of the match dragged along the strike plate, and then a hiss as the match caught fire. Flicking the lighted match towards the puddle of gasoline, the killer only stayed long enough to make sure the flames caught as the fire began its journey from the kitchen, through the living room, over the sofa, and finally, going up in a roar as it reached the body laid out in the 12-foot-long hallway. A minute later, and the killer was gone. Late in January of 1997, 16 months after Patricia's murder, Ronnie Jr. and his wife Kimberly were out in Lynchburg, Virginia, visiting one of Ronnie's old friends. Mitch Whidden was a former Marine who was now enrolled in the Pastoral Leadership Program at Liberty University, the same program and the same university where Ronnie Jr.'s own father had studied back when Ronnie was just a boy. It was also the same program and university where Ronnie had decided that he would like to go once his military service was over. Mitch knew that Ronnie had been very affected by the tragic and unsolved murder of his sister-in-law, Patricia, and Mitch hoped that his friend's decision to go into the ministry would help Ronnie find comfort and direction in his life. But when the two friends sat down together in the evening to pray, Mitch was totally shocked at the change that suddenly came over Ronnie when Mitch began to read out loud from the Bible. Jumping to his feet, Ronnie paced back and forth across the room before slamming his hands against his head, and then he turned to face Mitch and he said, "I did it. I killed her. I killed Patricia." One day later, on Saturday, January 25th, Mitch drove to Liberty University and put in a desperate request to speak to the university founder, Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr. Mitch needed Reverend Falwell's advice. Mitch had heard a murder confession from a friend, but the friend had refused to turn himself into the police. Within minutes, the Reverend's son, an attorney, was calling Detective Church at the Guilford County Sheriff's Department, advising the detective to go speak with a seminary student at Liberty University named Mitch Whidden. Detective Church did not waste any time. 9 days later, Mitch Whidden was talking directly to Detectives Church and DeBerry, along with an agent from the North Carolina Special Bureau of Investigation. And according to Mitch Whidden, Ronnie Kimball had not acted alone. On the night that Ronnie confessed to Mitch that Ronnie had killed Patricia, Ronnie had also said that it was his older brother, Ted, Patricia's husband, who had asked him to commit the murder. Although Ted had promised his younger brother a cut of the life insurance money Ted expected to collect after Patricia was dead, Ronnie had told Mitch that he agreed to kill Patricia because Ronnie would rather die than say no to his older brother. It would turn out that in the months leading up to her death, Patricia Kimball had every reason to be worried, not only about her marriage, but also about her personal safety. Patricia had been upset when Ted pressured her to sign off on a life insurance policy that would have paid Ted $100,000 in the event of Patricia's death, and $200,000 in the event that Patricia died an accidental death, like, for example, if she was burned to death in a tragic house fire. What Patricia did not know until just days before her death was that after Patricia had refused to sign off on that insurance policy, Ted had forged her name on the policy and submitted it to the insurance company. What Ted apparently did not know when he forged Patricia's signature and when he asked his brother Ronnie to kill Patricia was that the insurance company needed more than just Patricia's signature to issue the policy. They also needed Patricia to take a series of blood tests as well as a physical examination in order to approve the paperwork. And when the insurance company agent and the doctor's office called to schedule those tests, saying they had Patricia's signature on the policy, Patricia had become hysterical, said no to the tests, and slammed down the phone. It was on Friday, October 6, 1995, 3 days before her murder, and right after Patricia had found out about the forgery, that she called Gary and Rose Lyle and told Rose that if anything ever happened to her, Patricia, police should investigate her husband, Ted. What Patricia had never suspected was that Ted, who had always seemed to wield a lot of power and influence over his younger brother Ronnie, would somehow persuade or pressure Ronnie to actually harm or kill Patricia. And apparently, Patricia was murdered before the insurance company had time to contact Ted and tell him that the company could not issue the insurance policy he had requested for his wife Patricia, and upon her death, Ted would not be collecting on the forged policy. Right from the start of the investigation, Detectives Church and DeBerry suspected that Ted had to be involved, and they had even begun to suspect that Ronnie Jr. may have conspired with Ted to kill Patricia. But without a confession, and without any hard physical evidence that linked either brother to the crime, the investigation had ground to a halt. However, in the months before Ronnie's confession to his friend Mitch Whidden, Detective Church continued to collect information that suggested to police that Ted's motive for getting married in the first place was money. Gary Lyle, Ted's employer at Lyle's Building Supply, had made it clear that he was more likely to sell his business to Ted if Ted were married and settled down. And Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely, was one of at least 2 women who had all turned down Ted's marriage proposals. Janet's tears when she learned about Patricia's engagement to Ted had less to do with envy and more to do with concern for Patricia, who was wearing the engagement ring that Ted had offered to Janet just 1 month earlier. Police even speculated that Ted's decision to get part-time work at Precision Fabrics was just to make sure that he would have an alibi when he arranged for Patricia's murder. It would also turn out that Ted had a history of running insurance scams. He overreported the number of items that had been stolen from the Kimball house in those 2 earlier robberies, and he also inflated the claims related to the fire damage on the house. Ted would also be charged with stealing construction supplies from local businesses and from a local church that he would later sell at Lyle's Supply. On March 31st, 1997, more than 17 months after the brutal murder of Patricia Kimball, police arrested Ted and Ronnie Kimball on charges of first-degree murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. In September of 1998, almost 3 years after killing his sister-in-law, Ronnie Jr. was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3 months later, and 1 month before Ted was scheduled to go on trial, a search of Ted's prison cell revealed detailed escape plans, along with Ted's plans to hire someone to kill 5 witnesses who were scheduled to testify against him. Included on that hit list were Gary Lyle, the man who gave Ted his start in business, and Gary's wife Rose, Patricia's telephone confidant. 2 months after police discovered Ted's hit list, Ted Kimball avoided a jury trial by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder along with arson and conspiracy. In January of 1999, a little over 3 years after Patricia's murder, Ted Kimball was sentenced to 107 years in prison. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to edit the Amazon Music Follow Buttons video, but do it so that the audio and visual are slightly out of sync. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, if you want to check out our merchandise, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.